Buckle up, politics junkies. It's time for another episode of Special Session, the show that helps you wade through the Capitol chaos to help you understand what's really happening. Think of it as your political decoder ring. I'm your host, Brian Schott, managing editor of Utah Political Watch. This week on the show, it's budget time on Capitol Hill, and wallets could be a little light. Lawmakers want to make it harder and more expensive to find out what the government's up to. And we're supposed to have 3 co-equal branches of government, right? Not so fast. My guest this week is Jeff Worthington. He's the president of the Utah AFL-CIO, and we'll discuss the politics behind HB 267. That's the union-busting bill that lawmakers rammed through during this session. It takes away the rights of public employees to collectively bargain. Unions in the state are hoping to put the issue on the ballot through a referendum, but they got to get a whole bunch of signatures and have very little time to do it. That's coming up a little later in the show, but now, let's get to this week's headlines. It's budget time on Utah's Capitol Hill, and lawmakers got some not so great news about next year's budget. The revenue estimates that tell them how much money they should have to spend in next year's budget, they came in lower than expected. The general fund and the transportation fund had a little bit more money than what they thought they would have, but the income tax fund, which can only fund public education, higher education, and some social services, was about $127 million less than their last projections, which were in October. That lower than expected number is about $73 million less in one-time money and $54 million less in ongoing money. The October revenue projection showed $87 million more to spend in next year's budget in one-time money and $342 million more in ongoing money. These new revenue projections have dropped the ongoing revenue available to spend to just $14 million. And the ongoing revenue they have for schools and public services is, instead of $342 million, $288 million. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but a lot of the money was already spent, and for this to come in lower than expected, that's really going to put a crimp on how much money the legislature can put towards public education. Now, back in December, lawmakers did boost how much the state spends per pupil. That's called the weighted pupil unit, and Utah spends right around $4,500 per student here in the state. They boosted education funding by $200 million in December. That increased the weighted pupil unit per pupil spending by about 4%, and it also covered any enrollment growth in public schools. But here's the catch. Lawmakers are required to do that by law, so that 4% bump in public education funding, they had to do it. They had no choice. What these lower than expected revenue estimates mean is they're going to have a lot less extra discretionary money to put towards public schools. Now, what is that going to look like? Who knows? The Public Education Appropriations Subcommittee, in their budget recommendations that they made to legislative leaders this week, they're asking for another 1% discretionary increase in the weighted pupil unit, which is the per pupil spending, and that's about $42 million. And they're also recommending an extra $40 million to the Utah Fits All Scholarship Program, which is the state's private school voucher program. Now, if they approve that extra money for vouchers, that will bring the total funding for that program to $122 million. They started with just $42 million. Last year, they added another $40 million, and then this year, the sponsors wanted $80 million more, which would double the total money going to this vouchers program, and the Education Appropriations Subcommittee cut that in half to $40 million. But that would be $122 million going towards private school tuition or homeschool expenses that could go into public schools. And if you do the math, if they put that money into schools, that would increase per pupil spending by about another 3%. because that funding comes out of the same fund, the income tax fund. Now, even though these numbers are lower than expected, legislators have not taken proposed tax cuts off the table just yet. In December, when they were making all the budget decisions before the session, they took $165 million and set it aside for another round of tax cuts. They've cut taxes in each of the last 4 years. That $165 million, if they do an income tax cut, if they cut income taxes, that would be just enough to cut the state's income tax rate by 0.1%. And as we've reported in the past, I've told you in the past, when they've done that over the last 4 years, the lion's share of that money goes towards the top income earners in the state. It goes towards the wealthiest Utahns. Some projections have shown that 60% of that overall cash goes to the top 20% of income earners in the state, while the bottom 80% have to divide up the remaining 40%, and people at the lower end probably don't get any money at all, because even though lawmakers did give them an earned income tax credit, it's not refundable. And some of the estimates have shown that, like, for the average family earning around $80,000, every time they cut the income tax rate by 0.1%, you'll see somewhere between $7 and $12 a month extra. So it's $100 a year. Put that over 4 years, lawmakers are saying, well, they've gotten a couple $100. But those at the top end of the income scale have really gotten a lot more money, because that's where the lion's share of this goes. Now, this money, this $165 million that they've set aside, if they do an income tax cut, that also comes out of the same pot of money that funds public schools, higher education, and some social services. So that would be enough to add about another 4% to the state's per pupil funding, the weighted pupil unit, at $165 million, or they can cut the income tax rate by 0.1%. Governor Spencer Cox, in his budget recommendations, he was asking for them to eliminate the income tax on Social Security benefits, which would also eat up that entire $165 million that lawmakers have set aside. Now, over the past 4 years, and if they do it again this year, it'd be more than $1 billion of ongoing revenue that is paid for out of revenues that could be going towards public education. That's a lot of money that could go into education that's been eaten up by tax cuts that primarily benefit the wealthy and the private school vouchers program. Now, don't forget, Utah is consistently at or near the bottom of per pupil funding among all the 50 states and the District of Columbia. If you look at studies, Utah's behind states like Idaho, Mississippi, Alabama. Utah does not spend as much per student as those states do. Here we are again with legislative leaders looking to cut taxes in what is a down budget year. The last 4 years, when they've cut taxes, they've had a lot of extra money to spend, and that's because COVID relief funds, federal money, was flowing through Utah's economy and artificially inflating a lot of the revenue that states get. A lot of states did this. A lot of states saw that they were getting a lot of federal money. They were flush with cash. So lawmakers cut taxes. And there were warnings saying you're doing this in years where this extra money is not going to be sustainable, and you're going to have to come back and then cut the budget. And if you think that lawmakers are going to raise taxes to meet shortfalls, then you have not met the Utah legislature. So just pay attention to this going forward. Lawmakers are trying to make it a hell of a lot harder for the public, that's you, or the media, that's me, to get their hands on government records. There's a couple of bills that are quite alarming. They're going through the process right now. Let's talk about them. The first one is HB 69. That one is sponsored by Representative Stephanie Grecius. And what this bill does is it's going to make it a lot more expensive to fight a denial of an open records request. Currently, the process looks like this. You submit an open records request. It's called a GRAMA request here in Utah, which stands for Government Records Access Management Act. and you submit that to whatever agency you're trying to get documents from. If that is denied, then you can file an appeal with that agency, and they usually have about 30 days to decide on that appeal. And if they deny that appeal, as it stands right now, you take that appeal to the State Records Committee. We'll get to some changes about that in a second, but right now you appeal that to the State Records Committee. And if they deny that appeal, or if you win your appeal but the agency still doesn't want to turn over the records, then you can go to court. And if you win that court case, usually you can get the state to pay your attorney's fees. Not anymore. HB 69 significantly raises the bar for getting awarded attorney's fees in court. The bill says you can only get your attorney's fees if one of the parties acted in, quote, bad faith. And that's incredibly hard to prove in a court of law. If you go to court and you're trying to get those records and you win, you're going to have to show that this agency was intentionally trying to hide something from you, that they acted in bad faith. That's what HB 69 does. It sets an impossibly high standard to get your attorney's fees. Think back to the fight over former Attorney General Sean Reyes's calendars. A number of media outlets asked for those calendars. They were denied by the Attorney General's office. They appealed. That was denied. They went to the State Records Committee to appeal. The State Records Committee said, yeah, turn them over. And Reyes refused to do it. So they had to go to court. They went to court several times because Reyes actually sued one of the reporters trying to get access to his records. That's really expensive. Now imagine that you're just a regular citizen trying to get a hold of these records. That is so expensive, and you're going to think twice, maybe 5 times before you go to court to try to get these records. So that's the first bill that lawmakers are pushing through to try to limit your access to government records, the public access. Remember, government works for the public, but if they want to hide something, it's going to be really hard for you to get your hands on it. The second bill I want to talk about is SB 277 from Senator Mike McKell. Now, I told you earlier about the State Records Committee. That is a 7-member committee, and they meet monthly to hear appeals over denied open records cases. Well, this bill from Senator McKell would get rid of the State Records Committee, completely disband it, and replace it with one person, an administrative judge who would be appointed by the governor. Right now, the State Records Committee, they have someone representing the media on the committee. They have 2 seats representing the public. There are seats representing private business. There are seats representing government. So that's 7 members. It's a diverse group of people who come from different backgrounds, and then they deliberate and vote on whether or not to grant an appeal or deny it in an open records case. This bill gets rid of that committee and replaces it with a single person, an administrative judge who is appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. So instead of 7 people appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate, you would have 1 person appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. And if you'll remember, there was a whole backlog of the State Records Committee earlier this year because the Senate was upset about a number of their decisions giving records to the media and the public, especially in the calendar case. And so they just refused to confirm new people, and then the committee didn't have a quorum and they couldn't meet for several months. And what this is going to do is instead of 7 people, it'll just be 1 person who will decide whether or not to hand over government records to the public or the media. You hear legislative leaders talk about transparency a lot. They want to be transparent in what they do. No, they don't. You look at these 2 bills, HB 69 and SB 277, they don't want to be transparent. They don't want to be accountable to the media. They don't want to be accountable to the public. I'm going through that right now. I'm having to sue the legislature to get a press pass so I can attend media briefings with the Senate president or the Speaker of the House. I can't even get the House to answer my questions. I send them emails, I send them text messages asking questions for stories I'm working on, and they just completely ignore me. They will not answer my questions now. So when you hear these elected leaders talk about transparency, it is bullcrap. They do not want to be accountable to anybody but themselves. And that's why these 2 bills are so dangerous. This bill is interesting. It came out late last week, HB 533 from Representative Jordan Tusher. What that bill does is it creates a new mechanism for residents in a county to break away and form their own county. The last time Utah formed a new county was 1917, when Uinta County was formed, because residents in the northeastern corner of that part of the state, it was really hard for them to get to the county seat in Vernal. So they voted to create a new county so they could get to the county seat in order to do business. That's the last time it happened. I mean, right now there is a mechanism in Utah law which requires people who want to form a new county, they have to get signatures from at least 1/4 of the registered voters who live in the proposed new county. Then they can petition the county government. So if they get enough signatures from 1/4 of the people who live in that area, and then take it to the county government, county council, county commission, what have you, and put that petition, then it goes on the ballot. And then the people in that part of the county would vote whether or not they want to break off. This bill from Representative Tusher creates a new mechanism for doing that. If there's a county with 1 million more people, say, I'm just pulling out outside my head, Salt Lake County, and you have some cities who total 330,000 residents in that county. If the governments of those cities or municipalities, like the town council or the city council, they could pass similar resolutions to then put this on the ballot. So it makes it a lot easier to put it up to a vote about whether you want to break off from Salt Lake County. And the southwestern portion of Salt Lake County, Riverton, South Jordan, West Jordan, those areas of Salt Lake County, they are much more conservative than the other parts of Salt Lake County. Those cities, the city councils in those areas could pass resolutions that define the new county, and if they pass similar resolutions, and then that would trigger an election for people who live in that area. If they get a majority, then boom, bingo, you got a new county. The bill requires that there has to be a feasibility study to make sure that the new county and the old county or the remaining county could function properly financially, look at the division of assets, because this is a breakup, so they would have to see how they would divide up the assets within the county. The bill could not split a municipality or a city in half, but this would make it a lot easier for as I'm spitballing here, Salt Lake County, part of Salt Lake County, to split off and form their own county. The Republican-controlled legislature is also moving to get revenge on the courts for having the gall to rule against them in a number of cases last year. There was the gerrymandering case, there was Amendment A, there was Amendment D. The legislature lost all of those court battles. They still could lose over the challenge to the private school vouchers bill. A judge's ruling on that could come any day now. And lawmakers are frankly pissed off about it. So what are they doing? Well, they are going after the independence of the judiciary. I've already told you about the bills from Senator Brady Brammer that would change who can actually sue in court. And if a state law is found unconstitutional, then it would stay in effect until the appeals process is over. I've already told you about those. Well, there's a couple of other bills that are new up on the Hill that are also attacking the judiciary. HB 512 from House Majority Whip Carrie Ann Lisenby should really set off some warning lights on your dashboard. You know how when you vote on your ballot, there's a long list of judges asking whether they should be retained on the bench, those judicial retention elections? Well, HB 512 could really have a big impact on that. Right now, there's a bill out there which would raise the threshold for a judge to keep their job from a simple majority to 67%, which would be the highest in the nation, meaning if you wanted to get rid of a judge, you could run a campaign and all you would need to do is convince 1/3 of the population to vote against them. HB 512 creates a brand new legislative body that would have broad powers to investigate, and it says this in the bill, any issue brought up by lawmakers or the public about a member of the judiciary. If this commission decides to open an investigation into a judge, a member of the judiciary, then under the legislation, they would have to send out a press release announcing that they were opening this investigation. They were going to hold a hearing about it, and they would name the judge. It's just an allegation at this point. There's nothing proven against it, but already you've got this thing out in the public record in a press release saying we are investigating allegations against this judge. And at that public hearing, the committee could vote to not recommend that the judge be retained in those judicial retention elections, and that would show up on the ballot. There's already a recommendation from another body that evaluates the performance of judges, but now you have a second one. So you could have one body saying the judge should be retained, and then the legislature saying no, they should not be retained, and that will show up on the ballot. One of the biggest questions I got during the 2024 election is, where can I find out information about these judges? Where can I find out about their performance? Well, there's already a body that judges the performance or evaluates the performance of these judges. And now there's going to be two. And for voters who don't really pay attention and then they start reading it on their ballot, you could see conflicting recommendations on the ballot about whether or not to keep a judge. And if they raise the threshold to 67%, like under the other proposed piece of legislation, then that would be enough to kick a judge out of their seat. This new legislative committee would evaluate the judicial performance, but it doesn't have any guidelines. There are absolutely no guidelines on what judicial performance means. So they could decide anything if a lawmaker didn't like their ruling, if a member of the public was upset with the judge and made an allegation and they open an investigation. There's no standards in this bill for this legislative committee to evaluate the performance of a judge. What this is going to do is it's going to make what is right now a nonpartisan process. Judicial performance is nonpartisan. And what this bill is going to do is it could inject politics into that process and make it really, really rancorous. And it also cuts directly against the separation of powers, because they're now going to ask judges to answer to lawmakers. That's not how this works. We have three co-equal branches of government. We have the executive, we have the legislative, and we have the judicial. And what this is going to do is it's going to make one of those branches answer to another branch. And that is really, really troubling. There's also proposed legislation out there that would add justices to the Utah Supreme Court. Right now, it's 5 people on the Utah Supreme Court, and the legislature is upset at them because they ruled against them in the gerrymandering case and in Amendment D, and we're probably going to rule against them in Amendment A. So the legislature is upset about that. There's proposed legislation to change how the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court is selected. Right now, it's a vote of the members of the Supreme Court, and it would change it so that the Chief Justice is appointed and then confirmed by the Senate, which would bring it in line with what they do in Washington. All of this proposed legislation is a way to bring the judiciary to heel, because legislative Republicans don't like being told no. So the only check right now on what is becoming an increasingly imperial legislature, and what I mean by that is a legislature that is accruing more power unto itself. The only check right now is the judiciary, and lawmakers are trying to bring them to heel because they don't like it when they're told no. Joining me now on the show is Jeff Worthington. He is the president of the Utah AFL-CIO, and we're going to talk a little bit about unions in the state. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
Let's go through what happened with HB 267, which was sponsored by Representative Jordan Tusher, and I called it a union busting bill. It's a union busting bill. What it did is it removed the rights for public employees, teachers, firefighters, police, what have you, to collectively bargain. There are a few other things in the bill as well. Let's talk about how that moved through the process, because at one point it sounded like we had there was a compromise in the works with lawmakers, with the Republican-controlled legislature, and then it fell apart at the last minute. So give me your perspective on what happened with that piece of legislation.
Okay. We seen the bill coming, and we read through the bill when it was finally made available for everybody to read it. and we knew immediately that we did not like the bill. Went to the maker of the bill and told him it's just not a doable thing, and he offered a second substitute, to which at that time I had told him, okay, well, I can tell you right now that we could stand neutral on this, but I have to get the approval of my affiliate unions. And so I went back to my affiliates and I told them what the proposal was and what the second sub did, and they did not like it.
And to be clear, that second substitute, it did put back the rights to collectively bargain. But the sticking point, as I understand it, was a provision that required those unions who did represent public employees to hold a recertification vote every few years, and that needed a majority of all the union members, not just the people who would cast a ballot. So if a member did not cast a ballot, they would be counted as a no vote.
That's correct. That's correct. And that was a big stickler for us. And so at the time they were advertising it that, yeah, the unions have agreed to this. And when I went back to Representative Tusher and said, no, my unions did not agree to it, we're going to have to oppose the second sub. And so then that's when everything kind of went up in flames. And then they came out with a third sub, which we would have been in favor of. But on the reading calendar, it still showed first sub on the Senate floor. So as long as the first sub was sitting on the reading calendar, we had to stay in an opposed position. And we were waiting for the third sub to be introduced to where that we could say, okay, we're okay with the third sub, because that took, it changed the voting measures to where we still didn't like it, but we could live with it. So, but the third sub never materialized. So.
And it seemed like one of the sticking points or the last straw for members of the legislature is they thought they had an agreement, and you alluded to it, that you would be neutral on the bill. And when they finally decided to move on the original version of the bill and abandon the compromise legislation, it sounded like they were really angry that they were still getting angry calls and texts from union members who didn't like this. And that seems like such a weird reason to abandon, what could be seen, or to abandon working on a compromise because they didn't like hearing from people who opposed what they were trying to do.
Yeah, that's pretty much, as it progressed, and while we were waiting for that third sub to come out in the Senate, it became more and more evident to us that they had no intentions of ever introducing the third sub. They had the original bill, and it had passed out of committee and made it to the floor, and they were hell-bent on getting HB 267 passed out the way it was written.
Why do you think? I mean, obviously, and I've written this, and there's been they won't say this, lawmakers won't say this, but there's a lot of conjecture, and you could make a pretty compelling case that this bill was retaliation against the teachers' unions for some actions that they took last year. But they decided to go after all public employees, not just the teachers, so it wouldn't look like they were going after the teachers. Is that the way that you read this?
Yes, very much so. In the beginning, my public service employees, which are my ASME group, my firefighters, police officers, AFT, they were not the target. UEA was the target because they had poked the bear a few too many times, and we were kind of collateral damage. And so we had to protect, or try to protect, our positions, our rights. And we got sucked right into it, and it wasn't a position that I wanted to be into. And there was just no way of separating my public service employees from the UEA factor in this, and so it became a collective deal, and thus we've seen the consequences of that.
So what's the path forward? I mean, I know that there's an attempt to collect enough signatures to put this on the ballot as a referendum. You need about 140,000 signatures, and you have like 40 days to collect those, and you have to hit certain signature goals in 15 of 29 counties. It's very hard to get a referendum on the ballot. And I know that effort is coming. But one of the things that I hear from so many people is, why isn't there, like at least the threat of a strike to try to, because if you look at and I'm not advocating, I'm just curious as to why we're not hearing more about this in recent years. And there's been some studies. Teacher strikes have been very, very effective in getting improvements for teachers or accomplishing some of the teachers' policy goals. And I went back and looked. It's only happened twice here in the state.
Right. It's interesting that you'd bring that up, Brian. Day one of the session, we met with our Utah One Coalition, which includes all the teachers and public service employees. And I challenged UEA on that day to go on strike. I said, this is when you need to step up to the plate and go on strike to oppose this bill. And they wouldn't. They just wouldn't. They said that they have a contractual agreement that they got to be in the classrooms and, this and that. And I told them, well, a strike by the teachers would be a short-lived strike, because when the teachers don't show up and the kids don't have anywhere to go and the parents start getting mad, the parents start calling the legislators and things happen fast. And but our teachers association here in Utah, the leaders, I believe, did not have the desire to go on strike. When we held our rally in the rotunda, where we had 1,000 people there was a lot of teachers in attendance to that, and all the teachers were chanting that they wanted to go on strike. So this is the grassroots level wanted to go on strike. It was their local leaders that was refusing to go on strike. So
that surprises me, because this bill, it's an existential threat to the Utah Education Association. I mean, what is the reason? What is the incentive for teachers to join the UEA, to be a dues-paying member of the UEA, if they can no longer collectively bargain on your behalf? Now, it doesn't happen in every district. It was a district by district thing, but in those districts where they did do the bargaining, they can't do that anymore. And so this just seems like an existential thing. They've got that brand new building that they're putting up in Sandy, and it seems like, when you're facing something that threatens your very survival, you have to do whatever it takes, and so what you're telling me kind of surprises me.
Yeah. Well, to me, that showed the difference between an association and a union. Being a unionist for over 45 years now, I know the value of what unions do and the collective group of unions that will support other unions. And if we decide to go on strike, the other unions support us. And, with UEA, we would have supported them. We were offering our support as unions to walk with them, to picket with them, whatever they needed to do. But they are timid. They've never walked. They haven't been on strike. They don't know what it is. I gave them the example of the ski patrollers' recent strike up in Park City, and how effective that was. They were out for 10 days and they got everything that they wanted. Because they banded together and they walked the picket lines, and the local community up there donated into their strike fund to where they could have been on strike for a long time, and but UEA just doesn't have that desire to strike, and it's a weakness. It's a weak. They're going to be they're going to be attacked more and more if they don't show that they will bow their necks and stand up to the legislature and say enough is enough.
I think that I can't pass up asking you just about the attitudes towards organized labor from this legislature in particular. They tried to do something like this last year, but they were targeting all unions with a recertification vote. And they backed down after massive opposition, but this year they decided to go through. I don't think it was a coincidence that a few days after Governor Cox signed this bill into law, that there was a press release from ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a right-wing pro-business group, heralding Representative Jordan Tusher, who's the main sponsor of this bill, and Senate Majority Leader Kurt Cullimore, who was the Senate sponsor, praising them for passing this legislation. That does not seem like a coincidence at all.
No, it is not a coincidence. You pointed out Jordan Tusher and Kurt Cullimore being patted on the back by ALEC. And I think if we dig a little bit deeper, you'll find out that the Senate President, Stuart Adams, sits on the board of ALEC.
Yeah, and he was the president of it for a few years ago because they had their annual conference here in the state.
Right. Yes, that's the case. So, and this is the thing that really upset me about this session and these bills in particular. And there's still more bills coming up where Jordan Tusher wants to embed right to work into the Constitution, which is just a complete bizarre move.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that. Jordan Tusher is proposing a constitutional amendment that would enshrine right to work, meaning you cannot be forced to join a union as a term of employment into the state constitution. A few states do have that, but talk about why you think he's doing that and why you oppose that.
Okay, it right to work is a national law. It's all across the country. It affects every state the same. Right to work means that, if you want to go to work for a company that's a union company, you don't have to agree to pay the dues and you cannot be prevented from working for that company, which, that's the law that was passed. We may not agree with that 100%, but that's the law that's passed. What Tusher is trying to do is to get the amendment into the Constitution of Utah, therefore making it extremely, extremely hard for Utah to ever overturn right to work. Because once it's into the Constitution, then it takes a 2/3 vote, and it's a major effort to repeal something that's in the Constitution once it's there.
And the only people who can propose a change to the Constitution is the legislature. So if the people vote for this and put it in there, that's the same argument with Amendment D and Amendment A from last year. A constitutional amendment can only be proposed by the legislature, and it's all, and the people can't repeal it if they don't like it.
Right. Yes, we would have to have a majority Democratic legislature in order to ever repeal something like that.
Well, you would need a 2/3 legislature.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
Yeah,
and it's not going to happen anytime soon. So that's the tactic being brought forth there. And I think the citizens of Utah need to understand the underlying reasons for what Representative Tusher is doing. It's not forthcoming. I think he's trying to slide it in the shadows of darkness, so it's something that's
well, and I mean, to play the devil's advocate on this, though, it kind of seems like it might be a reaction to sort of the populist turn that the Republican Party has taken under Donald Trump. In the past, it was very pro-business, and if you got if the working class, if the Republican Party is now becoming the party of the working class, as we are seeing in election results, this sort of thing, they might become more favorable to unions. Donald Trump's pick for the Secretary of Labor is a union supporter. So, that's one of the arguments that I've heard as to why they might want to do this, to preserve Utah, preserve these Republican values or these pro-business values, and protect against a possible populist turn.
Yeah, that there again, I think it's smoke and mirrors tactic by the Trump administration on this, because if you take a look at what he's done, the NLRB, he has actually fired the 2 Democrats that were on that board, taking it down to 2 members now, to which does not satisfy a quorum, so they cannot even convene a meeting of the NLRB to handle labor disputes and stuff. So he, in that effect, he's destroying organized labor from the top down now.
So is the game plan for the referendum to file as the moment that you can, and then go, for one of a better phrase, balls to the wall for 40 days?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. As you know, referendums are not cheap. And so that's one of the big things right now is rounding up the financing to finance the referendum. And once the money's in place, then we will push the referendum throughout the state. And, right now we're in the process of getting information out to the constituents of Utah through social media, through other avenues, so that they can become educated on what really is happening. And, under the recent polls that have been done in Utah, the constituents of Utah are behind labor in the high 70s and 80 percentile bracket. So there's not a taste to or an appetite to destroy unions in the state of Utah. People support unions, and they support the fact that if unionists want to contribute money to their union dues, they should be able to do that. That's their paycheck. They should be able to pay their union dues. If they want to contribute to PAC funds and stuff, they should be able to do that, because that's their money. And I understand that as far as the PAC funds go, with the public sector employees, that, okay, they don't want the employer to be able to take that money out to contribute it to the PAC fund. And I understand that, with a governmental agency. But for the rest of the unions, it's a totally different animal, totally different story. And the rights of the unionists should not be taken away. That's their choice. That's what the freedom and democracy is all about.
Jeff Worthington, president of the Utah AFL-CIO, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation.
Well, thank you, Brian. I appreciate the time.
Before we finish up for this week, it's time for me to shamelessly plug some other stuff that I'm doing. If you don't know, I run an independent political news website. It's called Utah Political Watch. You can sign up for my newsletter for free at utahpoliticalwatch.news. You'll get all of my journalism, every story that I wrote, delivered straight to your email inbox. I promise there won't be too many emails, but it's a great way to keep up with what's happening in Utah politics. If you'd like some extra content, well, you can become a paying subscriber for as little as $5 a month. For that, you can get access to my morning News Fix newsletter. That's a curated roundup of the top local and national and international headlines that you need to start your day. And during the legislative session, you get the subscriber-only Daily Dispatch newsletter. That's a roundup of what happened up on Capitol Hill that day, afternoon headlines from all the local news sources. Also, we take a look at some of the newly introduced bills, and I'll tell you what's on the next day's agenda that's worth paying attention to. So you get all of that for just $5 a month. It's a hell of a deal. This podcast and my website, Utah Political Watch, they're all reader-supported. I don't sell advertising. I don't have big corporate donors. That means subscribers are my boss. I answer to you. You know, it takes time and resources to produce this kind of work. And if that's important to you, I'd really appreciate it if you thought about becoming a paid subscriber. I know not everyone can afford that right now, but if you can, I'd really appreciate it. And that's it for this week's episode. My thanks again to Utah AFL-CIO President Jeff Worthington. If you have a guest that you'd like to hear or a topic you'd like me to discuss, drop me an email, send me a message on social media. I'm on almost all of the platforms, except for the one, and I think you know which one that one is. Anyway, send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't yet, take a moment to subscribe to this podcast, leave a rating or review. That's how new listeners find the show. That's how the algorithm works. If you subscribe to the show and tell other people how good it is, or if you hate it or whatever, that's how new people find the show. Then the algorithm suggests the show to more people. So I'd appreciate it if you did that. Special Session is written and produced by me, Brian Schott. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. We'll be back next week.